Most people take time to figure others out. They rely on repeated interactions, long conversations, shared experiences. They need volume before they reach a conclusion. An empath doesn't. They walk into a situation and start reading it immediately, not consciously, not as a deliberate process, but automatically. Tone, posture, timing, emotional consistency. They don't just hear what's being said, they register how it's being said, when it's being said, and what doesn't match. And within a short window, something forms. Not a final judgment, but a direction. They notice when someone's words don't align with their behavior, when enthusiasm feels forced, when attention shifts at the wrong moment. These are small signals, easy to ignore if you're not looking for them. But an empath isn't looking for them, they're picking them up without trying. And this changes everything. Because while most people are still in the early stages of connection, exchanging basic information, building surface level comfort, the empath is already evaluating consistency. Not just who the person appears to be, but how stable that appearance is over time. At first, they stay open. They allow the interaction to develop, but they're watching. And when the pattern starts to show, even slightly, they adjust. If the signals are aligned, they lean in. They become more present, more engaged, more open. But if there's inconsistency, even in small ways, they don't confront it immediately. They reduce exposure. This is where the filtering begins. It's not loud. It's not obvious. There's no announcement, no explanation. They simply stop investing at the same level. Conversations become shorter. Responses become slower. The depth of interaction decreases, not out of judgment, but out of efficiency. Because from their perspective, continuing to invest in something that already shows signs of misalignment doesn't make sense. They don't need extended time to confirm what early patterns already suggest. And this is why their social circle stays small. It's not because they can't connect. It's because they choose carefully who they allow themselves to connect with. Every new interaction passes through a quiet filter, one that most people don't even realize exists. And here's the part that often gets misunderstood. This filtering isn't about perfection. They're not looking for flawless people. They're looking for consistency, for alignment between words and actions, for emotional stability that doesn't shift unpredictably. When they don't find it, they don't try to correct it. They step back because they understand something most people learn too late. The longer you ignore early signals, the more complicated the connection becomes later. So instead of building connections and then fixing them, they filter first. And when that filter is precise, it naturally reduces how many people make it through, which is why from the outside, it may look like they have fewer connections, but from their perspective, they're not losing people. They're preventing the wrong ones from getting close in the first place. Most people are comfortable staying at the surface. Conversations that move quickly, topics that don't require much thought, exchanges that fill time without asking for anything deeper. It works. It keeps things easy, predictable, socially acceptable. An empath doesn't operate there for long. They can engage in small talk, but they don't stay in it. Because while the words may flow, the connection doesn't. It lacks something they're constantly tracking, meaning not in a dramatic sense, but in a grounded, consistent way. Something real, something that reflects who the other person actually is beneath the surface. And when that's missing, the interaction starts to feel empty, not uncomfortable, just unproductive. So instead of forcing themselves to stay engaged, they begin to pull back internally. They listen, they respond when necessary, but their investment decreases. Because from their perspective, time spent in shallow interaction doesn't build anything. It doesn't reveal intent. It doesn't show consistency, and it doesn't create a foundation for trust. Now, here's where the pattern becomes clear. When an empath meets someone who communicates with depth, who speaks with intention, who shows alignment between words and behavior, who is willing to move beyond surface level exchange, the shift is immediate. They lean in, their attention sharpens, their responses become more thoughtful. The interaction slows down in a way that allows real understanding to form, because now there's something to work with, something that goes beyond scripted conversation. But those interactions are rare. Most environments don't support that level of depth. Social settings often reward speed, humor, lightness, not introspection or emotional clarity. And while an empath can adapt to those environments, they don't stay there by choice. They limit exposure not because they think they're above it, but because it doesn't align with what they're looking for. Repeated shallow interaction creates a kind of fatigue, not from the people themselves, but from the lack of substance. So they begin to choose differently. They engage less often, but more intentionally. They invest in fewer people, but with more focus. Because depth requires time, attention, and consistency. And those resources are not unlimited. This is where the misunderstanding happens. From the outside, it can look like disinterest, like distance, like they're not trying to connect. But the reality is the opposite. They're selective about where they place their attention. because they know that connection built on surface level exchange doesn't hold under pressure. It fades quickly. It lacks structure, and maintaining it requires constant effort without meaningful return. So instead of building wide networks of light interaction, they build narrow spaces of real connection. And when those spaces aren't available, they don't fill the gap with noise. They stay quiet because for them, silence is more valuable than conversation that doesn't go anywhere. And that's why their circle stays small, not because they avoid people, but because they refuse to replace depth with volume. Most people think social interaction is just conversation. Words exchanged, ideas shared, time passed. And for many, that's all it is. For an empath, it's something else entirely. Every interaction carries layers, not just what's being said, but how it's being said. The tone behind the words, the pauses between sentences, the emotional undercurrent that most people don't even notice. While others are focused on the topic, the empath is processing the entire environment, and that processing doesn't stop. It runs in the background constantly. Who's comfortable? Who's holding something back? Where the tension is, where the energy shifts. It's not a conscious effort. It's automatic. And because it's automatic, it doesn't turn off when the conversation continues. Now imagine sustaining that over time. A simple interaction for one person becomes a data-heavy experience for another. Every detail adds weight. Every emotional signal requires interpretation. And while none of it feels overwhelming in a single moment, the accumulation matters. Because energy isn't just spent on speaking, it's spent on observing, interpreting, and adjusting. At first, they manage it. They stay engaged. They respond thoughtfully. They adapt their tone, their pacing, their presence to match the environment. From the outside, it looks natural, effortless, even, but internally, there's a cost. And over time, that cost becomes noticeable, not as stress, not as discomfort, but as depletion, a gradual reduction in available energy. The kind that makes them pause before accepting another invitation, the kind that makes them reconsider how long they stay in a conversation because they've learned something important. Not every interaction is equal in value, but every interaction requires energy. So they begin to manage it. They shorten conversations that don't hold substance. They avoid environments that feel emotionally chaotic or unpredictable. They choose settings where the input is stable, where the emotional signals are clear, where they don't have to constantly recalibrate their responses. This isn't avoidance, it's allocation. They're deciding where their attention goes based on how much it costs to maintain presence. And when the cost is too high, when the environment demands constant interpretation without meaningful return, they step back, not abruptly, gradually, less frequent engagement, more time between interactions, longer periods of solitude, not because they don't like people, but because they need space where their system isn't constantly processing external input. This is where people misread the situation. They assume distance means disinterest, that reduced interaction means something is wrong. But for an empath, distance often means balance. It's how they recover clarity, because when they're alone, the noise drops. The external signals disappear. And for the first time in a while, they're only processing their own thoughts, their own emotions, their own pace. And that reset matters. Without it, the constant input would blur everything together. So instead of staying in environments that drain them, they step out of them. And when that pattern repeats, their social circle naturally becomes smaller, not by rejection, but by design, because they're not trying to maximize interaction. They're trying to maintain control over their energy. And once they understand the cost of constant exposure, they don't ignore it. They adjust to it. And that's why they choose fewer interactions over constant ones. Most people move through conversations focusing on what's obvious. The words being spoken, the general tone, the surface meaning of the interaction. It's efficient. It keeps things simple. An empath doesn't have that filter. They don't just hear what's said, they register what's underneath it. A slight delay before answering a question, a forced smile that doesn't reach the eyes, a change in tone when a certain topic comes up. These are small details, easy to overlook if you're not paying attention. But for them, these details are constant. They notice when someone says they're fine, but their posture tightens. When someone agrees too quickly without processing. When enthusiasm appears in words, but not in behavior. It's not something they search for. It's something that presents itself automatically. And once it's noticed, it doesn't disappear. This is where things become complex. Because recognizing these signals creates a choice. You can address it, question it, bring it into the open, or you can leave it unspoken and continue the interaction as it is. Most of the time, they choose not to confront it, not because they're unaware, but because they understand the cost of constant confrontation. Pointing out every inconsistency, every mismatch, every subtle shift, it disrupts the flow of interaction. It creates tension. And not everyone is ready to engage at that level. So instead of turning every observation into a discussion, they internalize it, they take note, they adjust, They recalibrate how much they engage based on what they're seeing. If the inconsistencies are minor, they stay present but cautious. If the pattern becomes stronger, repeated misalignment, emotional signals that don't match the situation, they start creating distance, not dramatically. Quietly, they reduce how much they share, they limit how often they engage. They avoid situations where the same patterns are likely to repeat. Because from their perspective, continuing to interact deeply with someone whose behavior doesn't align creates unnecessary complexity, and complexity requires energy. Now, here's the part most people don't realize. Seeing what others miss doesn't make interaction easier, it makes it heavier, because you're constantly aware of layers that aren't being acknowledged. Conversations that seem simple on the surface carry additional meaning underneath, and navigating that requires constant adjustment. Over time, that becomes unsustainable at scale. You can't maintain that level of awareness across dozens of people without it affecting your focus, your energy, your clarity. So something has to change, and what changes is access. They narrow their circle, not because they can't connect, but because they choose to engage more deeply with fewer people rather than superficially with many. They prioritize environments where what they observe aligns with what's being expressed, where there's less contradiction, less need to interpret hidden signals, because alignment simplifies everything. When words and behavior match, when emotional signals are clear, when there's consistency across interactions, the need for constant analysis decreases, the interaction becomes lighter, more direct, more sustainable. So they move toward that and away from everything else. And as that pattern continues, their circle becomes smaller, not out of isolation, but out of precision. Because once you consistently see what others overlook, you stop treating every interaction the same. You choose carefully where to place your attention and where to step back. Most people treat trust as something that grows automatically with time, spend enough moments together, share enough conversations, and eventually the connection becomes stable. That's the assumption. An empath doesn't rely on time alone. They're not measuring how long someone has been around. They're measuring how consistent that person has been during that time. Because for them, emotional safety isn't created by duration. It's created by alignment between words and actions, between reactions and situations, between what someone shows on the surface and what they consistently demonstrate underneath. Now, here's where it becomes precise. When an empath enters a new interaction, they don't immediately open up. They observe, not in a distant way, but in a calibrated way. They notice how someone responds to small things, how they handle disagreement, how they react under minor pressure, how they treat boundaries that aren't even clearly stated yet. These early signals matter because emotional safety isn't something you test with big risks. It's something you detect through small patterns. And if those patterns show instability, sudden mood shifts, dismissive responses, inconsistent behavior, the empath adjusts. They don't escalate the connection. They slow it down. They share less. They wait longer. They give the interaction space to reveal itself more clearly, not because they're unsure, but because they're verifying. They're checking whether the environment can handle something deeper without distorting it. And if it can't, they don't force it. This is where the difference shows. Most people try to build connection even when the environment isn't stable. They overlook small signs, hoping things will improve with time. An empath does the opposite. They treat small inconsistencies as indicators, not exceptions, because they understand something most people learn later. Instability doesn't fix itself through proximity. It becomes more visible. So instead of investing further, they begin to limit access, not abruptly. Gradually, they keep the interaction at a surface level. They avoid sharing anything that requires trust to be handled properly. They maintain a controlled version of themselves in that environment, not as a defense, but as a response to what they've observed, because for them, emotional safety is not optional. It's required for real connection. Without it, the interaction may continue, but it doesn't deepen. It stays contained, structured, limited. And over time, that limitation turns into distance, because maintaining a connection where you can't fully be yourself requires constant management, constant awareness of what you say, how it might be received. And that level of control isn't sustainable long term. So eventually they make a decision not based on a single moment, but on a pattern that has repeated enough times to be clear. They step back, they reduce engagement, they create space, they shift their attention toward environments where safety doesn't have to be questioned, where consistency is natural, where alignment is visible. And as that shift happens, the number of people who meet that standard becomes smaller, not because the standard is unrealistic, but because it's specific. Because once someone understands what emotional safety feels like, they don't compromise it easily. And that's why their circle stays limited, not due to lack of opportunity, but due to clarity. Because when safety becomes the priority, not everyone qualifies to be included. Most people avoid being alone. Silence feels uncomfortable. The absence of interaction creates a kind of pressure, a need to fill the space with something. Conversation, noise, distraction, anything that prevents that feeling from settling in. An empath experiences it differently. For them, being alone is not the problem. Being in the wrong environment is, because when they're surrounded by people who don't align, conversations that lack depth, interactions that require constant filtering, emotional signals that don't match what's being said, it creates a different kind of discomfort, not loud, not obvious, but persistent. And over time, persistence becomes heavier than solitude. Now, here's where the shift happens. At first, they try to adapt. They stay in conversations longer than they want to. They engage in environments that don't fully resonate. They adjust their behavior to maintain connection, even when the connection doesn't feel complete. But every adjustment has a cost. Every time they hold back what they actually think, every time they simplify what they feel, every time they ignore a mismatch just to keep the interaction smooth, they're reducing themselves slightly to fit the space, and that reduction accumulates. Not in a way that's immediately visible, but in a way that changes how present they feel in the interaction. They're there, but not fully. Engaged, but not invested. Participating, but not connected. This is where most people would try harder to fix it. An empath doesn't. They step back and evaluate. They ask a different question, not how do I make this work, but is this worth maintaining in its current form? And when the answer becomes clear, they adjust accordingly. If the connection lacks depth, they don't force it deeper. If the environment lacks understanding, they don't over-explain themselves. If the interaction requires constant compromise, they don't keep negotiating with it. They remove themselves from it, not out of frustration, not out of rejection, but out of alignment, because they understand something most people overlook. Connection that requires you to become less of yourself is not sustainable. It may function temporarily, but it doesn't hold long term. And this is why solitude becomes a choice, not a fallback. When they're alone, there's no need to filter, no need to adjust, no need to interpret or manage external input. The space is clear, stable, predictable, and that clarity allows them to reset, to return to their natural pace, their natural thoughts, their natural state. It's not isolation, it's restoration. And once they experience that contrast, the difference between forced interaction and peaceful solitude, the decision becomes easier. They don't seek out connection just to avoid being alone. They wait for connection that actually adds something, something real, something aligned, something that doesn't require them to shrink or simplify who they are. And until that appears, they remain comfortable in their own space. This is why their circle stays small. Not because they lack social ability, but because they've redefined what qualifies as connection. And when the standard is based on alignment instead of availability, fewer people meet it. So instead of filling their time with interactions that don't resonate, they choose stillness over noise. Because for them, being alone is not the absence of connection. It's the absence of misalignment, and that's a trade they're willing to make.